All right, hello everyone. How nice to see you all again. I am not Renee Fox. She had to teach at this moment, so I'm going to be subbing in as moderator. I hope you're not too disappointed, but I can tell you are. It's all right. I understand. This panel is called Adapting Old Monsters. Very excited about it. As you can see, we're going to start with Sheridan Le Fanu. Great stuff. Great stuff. So I think what I'd like to do is introduce everybody in the order that you'll be speaking, read through their bios, and then we'll just, if you hold your applause to the end, and then we will have folks come up one at a time and give their papers. Yeah? Sound good? Okay, and I will try and keep an eye on the time. All right, our first presenter is Amy Bonnaffons. Did I say that right? All right, phew. Who currently serves as interim associate prose editor at the Georgia Review. She holds a PhD in English and Women's Studies from the University of Georgia and has published 2 books of fiction. She's previously taught courses on monstrosity and gender at Emory University and at a women's prison. That's great. Our next presenter will be Joseph Chang, a PhD student at Lehigh University. His research interests include late Victorian Gothic, imperialism, and narrative form. He's working on a dissertation tracing the afterlives of late Victorian Gothic texts in fiction and film adaptations, focusing on the themes of empire, foreigners, and narrative frame. Next, we'll be presenting Panda Kroll. Kroll earned an MFA in Media Studies at Northern Illinois University and a Juris Doctor at Boston University. I think you're our first judge that we've ever had here.
Oh, I forgot to put in a bachelor's from UCSC.
Hey, banana slug. All right. Yeah, give it up for the banana slugs. Yeah. In addition to her law practice, she teaches biotechnology law and ethics at California State University, Channel Islands. Quite a distinguished panel today. Presenting with Panda, I believe, is Renée Fleischbein. Renée Fleischbein earned her PhD in English literature at the University of Southern Mississippi with emphases in children's and young adult literature, British literature of the long 19th and 20th centuries, fantasy literature, literacy studies, and rhetoric and its histories. And I just learned that Dr. Fleischbein, can I tell them? Is that okay? Just secured a tenure track appointment at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. SWASU. And then, last but certainly not least, Jose Nateras, a PhD student in theater and performance studies at UCLA, researching the performance of horror. Alongside his BA in theater from Loyola University Chicago and an MFA in writing at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Jose has experience teaching and is an accomplished writer, actor, and filmmaker. So please give it up for our panel. Amy, whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much for coming to this panel and for having me. So I started thinking about this topic last year when I was teaching a class about monsters in literature at Emory University. I'd had a fascination with monsters for a long time, particularly the way that monster narratives reveal cultural fears and hidden truths about gender and sexuality. Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 vampire novel, Carmilla, was on my syllabus, and therefore on my mind. And because of that, I started to become aware of several new adaptations of Carmilla that seem to have sprung up. So there's a new annotated edition from 2019, a graphic novel adaptation from 2023, and a web series that spawned its own film and a fan fiction novel. And all of these adaptations were created in the last decade, all by women, most or all of them queer. So I started to wonder why this sudden explosion of creative interest in a weird and relatively obscure novel. Why Carmilla? Why now? If, as Nina Auerbach famously asserted, every age embraces the vampire it needs, then perhaps these adaptations could reflect back to us something of our own moment, for us in general, and perhaps for queer women in particular. So in this talk, I'll offer an overview of the various recent creative responses to Carmilla, and I'll attempt to explain the original text's appeal, how contemporary creators have reckoned with it, and what their interventions reveal of contemporary queer and feminist politics. I'll also ask what is left out of these adaptations and why might that matter? So if you're not familiar with Carmilla, a quick intro. This slim, unsettling novel, which predates the more famous Dracula by 25 years, tells the story of Laura, a young half-English girl living with her English father in an isolated castle in Austria. One day, a mysterious visitor named Carmilla arrives and becomes their house guest. A strange relationship with erotic undertones develops between the two young women, while Laura starts to experience disturbing nightmares in which she's attacked by a black cat. Meanwhile, young peasant women in the surrounding villages start mysteriously dying. Spoiler alert, eventually Carmilla is identified as the vampire culprit and killed by Laura's father and his male allies. So the novel has been adapted before into film a few times and TV, and it's been a particular cult favorite with queer women since at least the 1950s. In some ways, this is easy to understand. Who wouldn't be taken in by a sexy, sapphic vampire story? For queer women in particular, the novel seemed to offer not only a rare for the time depiction of girl-on-girl desire, but also a strangely relatable evocation of the ambiguity and confusion of living life in the sexual shadows. Whether or not it intended to, the book illustrated the contradictions of living in the closet, or the more ambiguous space of self-questioning, feeling a desire that upends one's sense of oneself, and one's place in society. As Laura puts it in the novel, describing her feelings about Carmilla, I experienced a strange, tumultuous excitement that was pleasurable, mingled with a sense of fear and disgust. I was conscious of a love growing into adoration and also of abhorrence. This, I know, is a paradox. For those struggling with internalized homophobia, unnameable desires, and the fear of being labeled predatory because of who they happen to love, the novel spoke a kind of dark yet resonant truth. It says more about that, but I'm going to skip it. It's hard to know what Le Fanu would have thought of this, but it's fair to say he didn't intend the novel as a work of gay empowerment. Not only was that just not a thing in 1872, as Foucault and others have documented, same-sex love, of course, has always existed, but homosexuality wouldn't be a legible identity category until many years later. But also, the novel doesn't exactly cheer on its lovers. Carmilla is clearly a predatory monster. For Le Fanu, female sexuality seems like the real monster, especially when it exists independently of men. But as Jeffrey Jerome Cohen says, fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. Le Fanu is clearly working out some complicated feelings, personal and or cultural, about female sexuality, female power, and the possibility of same-sex love. The recent spate of adaptations push back against this tangled, fearful view of women and their sexuality and the bigotry it seems to invite. They ask, what if Carmilla wasn't really so bad? What if Laura wasn't really that weak? What if it was actually their society that turned them into a monster and a victim, or insisted on seeing them that way? If the women were allowed to tell their stories themselves, rather than having them narrated by a fearful Victorian white man, what would they say? All of the recent adaptations explore these questions by making the characters' latent queerness explicit. Queer love is now no occasion for hand-wringing, it's simply a fact. Carmilla is out of the closet, or should we say, out of the coffin. Let's look at Jordan Hall's web series, which ran from 2014 to 2016 and spawned a spin-off movie. In the series, Laura and her college friends casually flirt and have crushes on each other. And when Carmilla, the terrible roommate, who it turns out to be a vampire, emerges as a potential love interest, this is surprising only because Laura has hated her up to this point, not because of her gender. The series version of Carmilla is redeemable. She isn't evil, just complicated, a little like everyone's alluring toxic ex. The only male characters are a couple of meathead frat bros whose affable stupidity makes them easy targets for the women's snark. The series is fun, campy, and light. It could only have been made in a post-Stonewall rainbow flag kind of world. With respect to the original Carmilla, it seems to be asking, what if this supernatural romance were free to unfold without all those annoying men getting in the way? The 2023 graphic novel, Carmilla the First Vampire, by Amy Chu and Sue Lee, locates our lovers in 1990s New York's Chinatown. The Laura character is a queer Chinese-American social worker named Athena. The characters don't seem to struggle with their own queerness at all, but the book is critical of larger social systems. In this version, Carmilla targets young women whose status as poor, perhaps unhoused, perhaps engaged in sex work, all associated with an underground gay club, makes them vulnerable, easy prey because they're forgotten or undervalued and must live precarious lives in the margins. In this version, the problem isn't just one bad woman, it's the system that allows cruelty to flourish. The book thus resonates with contemporary post-third wave intersectional feminism, influenced by thinkers like Kimberlé Crenshaw. It also resists portraying its Laura as a victim, and she actually draws strength from her cultural identity. In an 11th hour disclosure by her grandfather, she learns that she actually comes from a long line of Chinese vampire hunters. He tells her, "Those who may seem the weakest, in fact, have tremendous power." Emily Harris's 2019 film is in many ways a straightforward adaptation, but it shows explicit scenes of lovemaking between Laura and Carmilla and recasts Laura's governess as a repressed lesbian herself who takes out her internalized homophobia on her charge and enlists male authorities to quash their budding love. Harris reinterprets Carmilla as a simple love story thwarted by patriarchal violence and sex negativity. Carmen Maria Machado's annotated edition, also from 2019, makes a similar point, recasting the vampire victim duo as consensual lovers whose story was distorted and violently repressed by agents of patriarchy, including Le Fanu himself. Machado writes an introduction to Le Fanu's text in which she invents a pair of fictional historical sapphic lovers, Veronica Housel and Marcia Moran, who supposedly served as the real-life models for Laura and Carmilla. Marcia was not a vampire, but perhaps, quote, an ambitious proto-feminist and the victim of a political conspiracy. These claims, which Machado bolsters through scholarship by a fictional feminist academic, recast the novel as a kind of failed or sinister nonfiction, a work of narrative theft rather than imaginative fancy. Her framing of the novel, as metafictional and imaginative as it is, as cleverly nested as it is in layers of irony, as willing as it is to make fun of itself by cosplaying the voice of the humorless feminist academic, seems primarily motivated by grief, about the absence of a queer canon, about violence against queer women, and the silencing of women's voices. Veronica and Marcia may not have literally existed, but what if they had? Others like them surely did. In asking this question, Machado gestures toward the negative space created by all the queer stories that remain untold. She wonders what narratives we might have had access to had women been allowed to tell their own stories. So I hope it's clear by now how all of these adaptations, each in their own way, filter Carmilla through contemporary understandings of gender and queerness. Respectively, they revel in the freedom to take queerness for granted. They position queerness as a stable and definable trans-historical identity. They critique larger systems like patriarchy, heteronormativity, and institutionalized homophobia, and expose how they intersect. They prioritize the politics of representation, insisting that the women in the novel be allowed to speak for themselves. This list provides part of the answer to our original question, why Carmilla, why now? Our contemporary moment in which queer identity is more visible than ever, and yet queer freedom is still under direct threat, seems to demand new versions of old stories, ones in which the living reclaim the voices of the unjustly undead. I can't help but think, too, that these queer resurrections of Camilla might be partly a welcome corrective response to the culturally ubiquitous Twilight, an aggressively heterosexual vampire text steeped in Mormon purity culture. But though I welcome and delight in these contemporary adaptations, I also can't help but ask, in what ways is the original novel revivified through this exposure? And in what ways does exposure to light cause something of its original meaning and richness to shrivel and recede from view? If Gothic literature is akin to a haunted house, a text that's animated by the specters of the voiceless, by the threat of the unsayable breaking through, then its particular method of meaning-making depends on fear. While we've certainly evolved as a culture out of some of the small-minded fears that animated Le Fanu's text, is it premature to declare Carmilla liberated from the dust and damp of her coffin? Following the notion that the elucidation of one discourse always marginalizes others, the outness of the novel's queer themes may paradoxically obscure how Carmilla the original was haunted not only by the monsters of female sexuality and queerness, but also of racial and national otherness. I'll give one quick example. In the original novel, a seeming throwaway line associates Carmilla with a mysterious black woman who may or may not transform into the black cat who attacks Laura in her dreams. The novel leaves the question open of how Carmilla relates to this woman and to the cat. Are they allies, controllers, or aspects of herself? In any case, the specter of female sexuality is inseparable from the fear of racial otherness, which is aligned with animality. The threat to Laura's sexual purity is also a threat to her whiteness, related to her English national identity, also cast as questionable and vulnerable throughout the novel. This aspect of the text raises a host of uncomfortable questions that are unfortunately still relevant today, about the literary and filmic associations of horror and death with physical darkness, about the whitewashing of mainstream queer movements and the messiness of interracial feminist solidarity, about the racist hypersexualization of Black women's bodies against which myths of white female sexual innocence and vulnerability were created in opposition, about the violent conflation of Blackness and animalistic sexuality and the way that these conflations problematize depictions of desire's inherent wildness. Some of the contemporary adaptations acknowledge this Black character in passing, but none take up these questions. In their focus on queer love and structural homophobia, other messy questions about race, class, and purity get sidelined. In pointing this out, I don't mean to call out any of these creators specifically. No one adaptation could address everything, every question that the original raises. But I want to ask, how might these welcome reinventions prompt us to linger in the long shadows cast by Le Fanu's novel and consider what uncomfortable insights might still be hidden there, particularly about desire and the way that we talk about it? How might a deeper conversation between these adaptations in the original book help us to address questions about the intersections of queerness with other fraught categories of identity, and consider the way that queer identity is constructed against or through them? When we remake or rescue a problematic text with focus exclusively on representation of one identity group, what else gets left out? Today, I hope to celebrate these clever contemporary adaptations while also pushing all of us who are engaged with this vibrant and maddening text to ask even more of it and more of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Joseph? Is this it?
Separate slides.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Different files. So let's see, here's our slides. Yours is this it, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Can't.
Thanks so much.
And this forward and this is back. Okay, so you need to go back.
God, thank you so much. Okay. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. In this short presentation, I would like to talk a bit about the newest television adaptation of Dracula, Dracula 2020 by BBC. Okay, so the title of my presentation is The Empire's Kiss, Contagion and Cultural Colonization in Dracula 2020. Okay, so basically in this short presentation, I would like to kind of explore how that while in the original novel, one of the most central theme of the story is the idea of the reverse colonization, which is kind of the fear of a Eastern and foreign vampire invading and kind of colonizing, reverse colonizing the British Empire. So that was the original central theme of Dracula, the novel. But in this newer adaptation, Dracula 2020, I feel like the theme of reverse colonization was kind of drastically toned down. And the focus of the film kind of shifted towards another aspect of colonization, which is cultural colonization. Okay, so before we dive deeper into the discussion of these two themes, I would like to quickly just go through the story of Dracula 2020 to give us a basic understanding of this adaptation. Okay, so Dracula 2020 is a mini-series that's made up of 3 episodes. So the first episode is titled The Rules of the Beast. So in the first episode, we follow a young British lawyer, Jonathan Harker, on his journey on a business trip towards Transylvania. So Jonathan is there to help Count Dracula purchase some real estate back in London, right? And we know that Jonathan quickly finds out that actually Dracula is a vampire, so he needs to stop Dracula from entering his homeland. That's episode 1. Episode 2 is titled The Blood Vessel. So in episode 2, we follow a Russian ship, which is called the Demeter. We follow Demeter's journey towards England. And on this journey, there are a series of gruesome murders and disappearances of the passengers that start to pop up. And we know Dracula is on board this ship, so Dracula is behind all these gruesome horrors and mysteries. So that's episode 2. Episode 3 is called The Dark Compass. So in episode 3, we see Dracula entering England, but because of a slight twist at the end of episode 2, Dracula enters not Victorian England, but modern-day England. Right? So basically, episode 3, we see Dracula settling down in modern-day England, and in the process, he became more and more obsessed with a young girl in London named Lucy. Okay, so that basically is a spoiler-free introduction to the story of Dracula 2020. Okay, so if we kind of take a second look at the story, we will kind of feel that in this adaptation, the theme of reverse colonization, which is so important in the original novel, is actually pretty much toned down here. And the spotlight is shifted towards the idea of cultural colonization. So let us take a look at reverse colonization first. So in the original novel, the idea of reverse colonization is always there throughout the whole plot. There is a dread of how a foreign vampire, a foreign monster can invade and reverse colonize the British Empire. For example, when Jonathan thinks of Dracula's possible invasion, entrance into London, this is what Jonathan thinks. He thinks about how the teeming millions of British people might be enslaved by this foreign vampire, and how Dracula might create an ever-widening circle of semi-demons. Right? So we can see from Jonathan's journal that his thoughts that Jonathan is actually pretty anxious about the massive scale and the massive impact of Dracula's entrance, Dracula's invasion into the British Empire. Right? So there is always this concern about reverse colonization. But this is actually pretty much toned down in Dracula 2020. After Dracula's entrance into England, we can see that Dracula actually has very little interest in widely spreading his vampiric virus. He has little interest in creating an army of vampires. Instead, he is actually focusing more on a few individuals in London that he is himself interested in. For example, he's interested in developing his relationship with Lucy here. So we can see how the sense and the dread of a massive invasion and reverse colonization is almost nowhere to be seen here in this newer adaptation. Okay, so in place of the theme of reverse colonization, actually the spotlight is shifted towards cultural colonization. So by cultural colonization, I'm thinking of how a very dominant British or Western culture is kind of aggressively exported or invaded the place, say the colonies or other lands, and kind of influencing and transforming, westernizing the subjects of the colonized. Okay, so a good example of this westernization and cultural colonization is in the character of Count Dracula, how this new version of Count Dracula is different from his previous counterparts. Okay, so in the novel, Dracula is pretty much unmistakably a foreigner in the novel. He has a very foreign accent. His appearance, his mannerisms are just very jarring to the Victorian people back then. But in this newer version, we can see that actually Dracula is somewhat westernized. He speaks pretty perfect English without much accent. Some would argue that he even has a bit of a hint of a British accent there. And we can see that Dracula's appearance, his clothing, his mannerism is actually not that much different from a contemporary British gentleman. And in the story, we can also see Dracula kind of embraces the Western culture, the British culture. For example, he says he loves modern science. And he talks about British history like he likes them really, really much. So Dracula here is kind of westernized to some extent. And this westernization of the character of Dracula can also be seen in how this new adaptation reworked the mechanism of blood drinking. So in the original novel, when a foreign vampire drinks the blood of say a British character, this blood drinking is usually interpreted as an injection of dangerous, evil, and potentially infectious agents into a British body. Right? So it's like you can see the direction there, an Eastern monster injecting infectious agents into a British body. Right? But this logic of blood drinking is kind of reversed in Dracula 2020. For example, when Dracula, we can see that in the story, when after Dracula drinks the blood of the British lawyer Jonathan Harker, he could suddenly speak pretty perfect English with some British accent in it. And in episode 2, after Dracula killed off and drank the blood of a German sailor, Dracula could suddenly speak perfect German. Right? And later on, after there is a mentioning of how Dracula killed and drank the blood of a British physicist in order to learn modern science. Right? So it's very interesting how we can see that when Dracula drinks the blood of these British characters, he is actually not only taking in their blood, he is kind of absorbing and imbibing their language, their culture, their knowledge and belief system. Right? So when we think of this reworked mechanism of blood drinking, it's actually kind of somewhat like the reverse of the novel, right? Because in the novel, when an Eastern monster drinks the blood of a British character, it's like an Eastern monster spreading infectious disease into a Western body. But in Dracula 2020, we can see that when Dracula drinks the blood of these British characters, it is actually these British characters kind of spreading their culture, their language, injecting these things into the body of Dracula. So this is kind of reversed there. So symbolically thinking, this reworked blood drinking could be kind of seen as a sort of a westernization of Dracula, or a sort of a cultural colonization of Dracula. Okay, so, and this is interesting because the theme of cultural colonization could not only be observed in the character of Dracula, but also on the level of the text itself. For example, in the original novel, one main source of horror comes from its kind of inclusion of a lot of Eastern folklores in there. For example, Transylvanian superstitions, local beliefs about vampires. That's what kind of make the original novel kind of scary. But in Dracula 2020, this element of Eastern folklore is actually almost entirely erased and nowhere to be seen. And in its place, we can see that there are lots and lots of references to the Western horror tradition and Western horror heritage. For example, there are many playful allusions to classic Western horror texts like films and novels. And the most obvious examples are references to past Dracula adaptations there. For example, Dracula 2020 refers to Nosferatu, one of the earliest adaptations of Dracula. So where the makeup design of the original Count Orlok is kind of replicated in Dracula 2020 in the makeup design of Jonathan Harker after he has been transformed into a vampire. So spoiler alert, I'm sorry. Yeah. So yeah, it also refers to other Dracula adaptations like The Horror of Dracula, where in the last scene of the film, there's a confrontation between Dr. Van Helsing and Dracula. This scene is totally kind of replicated in the last confrontation scene in Dracula 2020. So you can kind of see the resemblance in the scene composition there. Right? So there are lots of references to past Dracula adaptations, but it also kind of alludes to other classic Western horror texts. For example, it alludes to the picture of Dorian Gray in one scene. It calls back to Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. And it also alludes to some American horror films like The Shining and The Silence of the Lambs. Okay, so these kind of collection of playful allusions and references to the Western horror heritage kind of makes up a large part of Dracula 2020. So you can see that the Eastern folklore element is eliminated, and in its place we got the Western horror heritage here. So on the level of the text, there is also some kind of Westernization or cultural colonization probably going on there. Okay, so with this theme of cultural colonization in mind, we can see that the role that the British Empire plays in Dracula, it kind of evolves in this newer adaptation. So in the original novel, it's more about the fear of how when an Eastern vampire kind of brings about reverse colonization and spread his vampiric virus towards the West, towards the British Empire. So when we think of it this way, it is the Eastern vampire, the foreigners, that are thought of as contagious, like spreading their vampire disease. But this is totally reversed in Dracula 2020, where it's more about how the British Empire and the West brings about cultural colonization and spreading Western culture towards the East, towards the colonies. So here, the entity which is contagious is probably the West or the British Empire itself. So we can see that in Dracula 2020, it's not so much, not only about vampires' contagion, but also about the empire's contagion. So yeah, to conclude, while in the original novel, the main fear is about how an Eastern vampire might bring about reverse colonization, in Dracula 2020, this seems to be this central theme is kind of shifted. It's more about somewhat like a self-conscious reflection about how the West and the British Empire can bring about cultural colonization, perhaps towards the East, towards foreign lands and the rest of the globe. Okay, so yeah, that's my current thought on this newer adaptation of Dracula 2020. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, okay, I'll be on the right because I'm gonna cut. Oh, sure. Oh, did you say you wanted both of us at the same time? Oh, do you want me to go by myself? I don't care, I'll go both. I'll go with you. We're a dynamic duo here. We are. But we're different. All right. With timers. Because we're gonna cut our time in two.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I forgot my water. Damn it.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Very pathetic.
So there's room for it.
There's not, but that's okay. You're gonna do this though, right? So come on.
What, just like that? Let me just check that's working. Proof of concept. Yep, okay.
All right. Do you want to introduce us? I'm Renee. This is Panda. We've decided that we should probably have a quick trigger warning. We're talking about the film Poor Things, and there is mention of suicide. There is mention of suicide. So that's your trigger warning. So Poor Things is the 2023 film directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, based on the 1992 eponymous novel by Alistair Gray. It is a satiric, surreal, and sensual film that reimagines the Frankenstein story with a female protagonist. After the suicide of a pregnant woman, she is mysteriously revived by Dr. Godwin Baxter, referred to as God throughout the film. The moniker of God is fitting because, as we learn through flashbacks, he resurrected the pregnant woman by removing the brain of the fetus she carried and transplanting it into the dead woman, thus preserving the corpse of the mother and the mind of the child. With her emergent new life, the monster, Bella Baxter, embarks on a journey of self-discovery. The story of Bella's evolution is not only philosophical and political, but also intensely sexual, especially as she engages in her favorite activity, which she calls, quote, furious jumping, end quote. The film enjoyed both critical and popular success, earning 4 Oscars, 2 Golden Globes, and over $100 million at the box office. In the court of public opinion, however, many characterize the film as anti-feminist, or perhaps worse, faux feminist. Critics also claim that the film is ableist, citing its arguably comedic descriptions of traits associated with autism and disfigurement, and derogatory slurs of Bella's seeming lack of mental development that is misaligned with her body. Primarily, the film's detractors criticize what could be a pedophilic premise of Bella's childlike sexual self-discovery compared with the maturity of her body. The film's proponents argue, however, that ultimately Bella is an inspirational female protagonist because she evolves to liberate herself from the mores of the 19th century socio-sexual hierarchy that limited women of the period. We must first address the enigmatic title, which made us wonder if Bella is supposed to be poor. Bella could be considered poor because she is a mind out of body, and they may never exist together in harmony. Bella might also be considered poor because she lived while her mother died, echoing the lack of feminine nurturing that Mary Shelley's monster endured. We conversely wondered if Bella is supposed to be a thing, and nothing more than an experiment Godwin performed for egotistic reasons, just to see if he could. Other than who or what the title refers to, the film is particularly important at this moment, considering the current active political agenda seeking to make Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, which is a warning, not a blueprint, into reality. If successful, this agenda, Project 2025, would return women to a social place where they are little, if at all, more than chattel valued only for their reproductive capacity, as was the plight of many women in the 19th century. Poor Things goes beyond the reductionist politics of feminism and gender norms. The film is concerned with agency and the nurturing of that agency, and challenges those who would diminish women's existence or limit their role to something less than fully human. Ultimately, ideas about proper feminism and female sexuality collide in the film. We are called upon to understand our preconceptions about norms and nature as hubristic and encouraged to redefine such norms and nature as ever-evolving and self-determining. Okay. The agency of women has long been suppressed by the patriarchy. Indeed, women have had to fight for generations for basic rights that men are afforded without question or hesitation. Sadly, the reality is that women have yet to achieve equality. For example, according to a December 2022 Government Accountability Office report, white women earn 82 cents for every dollar a white man earns, black women earn 63 cents, and Hispanic or Latino women earn 58 cents. Furthermore, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, women make up 44% of the workforce, but hold only 41% of managerial jobs. Thus, though women are a significant part of the workforce and do a significant portion of the work, they are not afforded the same compensation or promotion that their white male counterparts. But that's just the workforce scenario. Today, the polarizing issue of women's rights, the right to bodily autonomy, the right to make their own healthcare decisions, and even the right to choose or not to enter into marriage or have children is being questioned and voted on next month. The quest for agency has been a long slog for women. Women in the early 19th century were prohibited from pursuing higher education. In fact, many men and women were lucky to be educated at all, though young white men in England of a certain socioeconomic class were more likely to be educated than others. This circumstance would change with the Elementary Education Acts of 1870, which made education compulsory for children ages 5 to 13, and of 1880, which imposed penalties on businesses employing children ages 10 to 13. Some women, including Mary Shelley, were given an education, perhaps only because of who her parents were: Mary Wollstonecraft, early feminist writer and advocate, and William Godwin, political philosopher, journalist, and novelist. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein with purpose. Through her parents and their acquaintances, Shelley knew scientists of her day. According to literary scholar Ann K. Mellor, Shelley, quote, grounded her fiction of the scientist who creates a monster he can't control upon an extensive understanding of the most recent scientific developments, end quote. Shelley's portrayal of hubris is one that she modeled after what she saw in others. With the novel Frankenstein, Shelley responded to Erasmus Darwin's 1794 suggestion, based on Aristotle, that advocates that because in plants it is the male that produces the seed while the female only provides nourishment, males are the more important human contributor to reproduction, and, quote, the mother does not contribute to the formation of the living ends in normal generations, but is necessary only for supplying nutrients and oxygenation, end quote. When scientists take this hypothesis to its conclusion, if men can find a way to provide the nourishment required for reproduction, the womb, then women, being unnecessary for any other purpose, can be eliminated. Shelley purposely sought to demonstrate the more realistic outcome of this hypothesis, which is revealed in Victor Frankenstein's immediate rejection of his creation that never receives the nurturing a mother would have provided. In Poor Things, Bella also lacks the nurturing that a mother would have provided. She is, in a real sense, her own mother, and thus learns to nurture herself through the control of her agency. Much like Godwin reclaims agency for reproducing females, Bella reclaims her own agency, including her sexuality, where she chooses to live, and even how she earns her money, which she does by doing the thing that gives her the most pleasure, sex. But Bella's unabashed control of her own sexuality has some viewers mistakenly labeling her as a victim of the patriarchy. Because she fulfills her needs in the ways that she wants, she uses the patriarchy and its desires to exploit the female body rather than allowing it to use and control her. Those who would label Bella as poor suffer the error of condescension. Bella is not sexually exploited, even with her resurrection as an adult woman with a child mind, because her sexualization arises after her self-discovery of masturbation and after she determines to leave the safety of Godwin's home to seek her own destiny. In this iteration of the Frankenstein story, rather than trying to eliminate the woman in the reproductive cycle, Godwin preserves the woman and the child through his experiment.
Okay, let me just make sure we don't go over time. Can you fix it?
To do that.
Okay, that was 9 minutes. Hi, so I wanted to ask if Bella is a thing. And the first question is, who decides, right? Who decides? What is a monster, right? So a thing would be something that's an object, so objectified. So I asked Spencer, he's in the audience, I said, look, I don't decide, what do you call a monster? Let's talk about monsters as things. And Spencer gave me a great answer. Do you mind telling the nice people?
Yeah, one of the definitions of monstrous I use is from Kroll, and that a monster is determined by, is it a physical threat and impure, impurity being constituted as something that is, impurity being something that is constituted as an and, not as an or, something that is both things and not one or the other.
Right, so impure. And I believe that we heard from Maddie Bryce in her keynote talk about purity and the oppressiveness of that idea. So I would love to hear some other definitions. So we heard Spencer talked about impurity plus threat, right? Do we have in the audience perhaps any other definitions that people would like to propose? Because I'm proposing that there's not just one definition, and I'll give you one that I like, but I'm interested in yours. So anybody besides Spencer brave enough to give in your scholarship? We can leave it at that for now. Okay, so the definition, that what I was interested in this conference and in Poor Things and about monsters is because I was teaching a class in biotechnology law where it turns out, I knew there's some controversy about GMOs, but it turns out that it's a very polarizing issue, and it turns on this idea of what is nature, what is natural. Who decides? Who decides what is natural, right? And that natural is often used as a synonym for normal or norms. And we crave norms. We have a evolutionary, I guess, or maybe psychological desire to have a world that is in order, right? An orderly world that has norms that we agree on, and then we call those, natural, right? And there's even in the law, there's even something called natural law, right? And that's used a way to bully people, a way to justify things like slavery or other things that we say, well, it's natural. The races should not intermarry. That's miscegenation. That's a sin. It's unnatural. So I became very interested in this idea of transgressive beings. So as my colleague Renee told us, there's some ideas about, to turn back to Poor Things, Bella as a difficult protagonist for feminists to relate to. And if you Google Poor Things and feminist, you will see a whole stream of critiques as this was done by a man, this is a man's view, she's very sexual, but this is voyeuristic, right? And then, of course, all the problems we heard, which are real, which is she has a baby brain. My response, she's a quick study, guys. She learns quick, right? And there's a really kind of moving scene, I felt, where Godwin, right, her creator, is reading to her in bed, and she says, stay, and he says, I'm not going to do that. And I love that because it took it out of the paradigm of, victim and creator and as the dominant one in the relationship. And he does try to keep her safe, and she does feel constrained, but she breaks free, and he lets her go. So I think in that way, I feel justified in calling her a feminist protagonist, even though the film was written by a man, and the novel that it was based on was written by a man. And in fact, when I looked at many of these critical articles saying that the movie is faux feminist, I noticed that most of these critiques were written by men. So there, okay? So there. So who decides? So in fact, the movie is enjoyable. Oh, the one thing that really I felt was, what's the word I want to say? Justifying was that the National Review, you may or may not know, is a very conservative publication. After this film won 4 Oscars, Emma Stone, who by the way gets a producer credit, so there, right? And is, I don't know if you guys if you haven't seen the film, see it. Don't bring your mother, right? Like, don't bring your kid. I think it's rated R, and it could probably be rated X in some scenes because it's very, very graphic. And Renee and I went there the first time we ever met. Let's go see the film. And I was a little bit like, oh, this is a first date. That's a little awkward. So be aware of that when you go to see the film. But in fact, it's, the director uses fisheye lenses. It's very surreal. In some ways, looks like a video game universe to some extent. And you'll see this is an example where the duck has 4 legs. So the film's very playful. Emma Stone is having a great time. And she won 4 Oscars. So the National Review tore apart Hollywood elite for giving this film 4 Oscars and Emma Stone the Best Actress Oscar. By the way, this film the only film that won more Oscars this year was Oppenheimer. So it did really well, which is amazing for such a transgressive, hypersexual film that basically takes on capitalism. But one of the things that the National Review hated, which I loved, was she makes her living as a sex worker, right? It's like, yeah, it's sex positive, right? So this idea of a transgressive figure, I think, was really liberating. And the other thing that, so I put Spencer on the spot and asked him what the definition of monster is. So I do have a definition from when an article that I have my students read in my biotechnology law and ethics class, which is called Playing God in Frankenstein's Footsteps. And then, what else is it called? I didn't cite it here. So the idea is that we say playing God when scientists go too far, when they transgress, and that there's a hubris that Dr. Frankenstein, his fault is that he suffers from hubris. He abandons the creature that he puts into the world, and he abandons the creature he puts into the world, and he doesn't get buy-in from the scientific community. So I will leave you with a final slide because I'm out of time. So not only are norms and nature transgressed when we talk about monsters generally, and Bella specifically, but I wanted to challenge our definition of life because it turns out there's a continuum. That in synthetic biology, in astrobiology, even if we talk about the developing fetus, and also cybernetics, right, AI, there's a question about what is life. And I have this great quote from Etxeberria, who is a Basque researcher who writes about transient life forms. So these are life forms that are somewhere in between inert and living beings. So a monster could be a transient being, and this shatters our idea of norms if we don't even know if something's, a thing or alive. And I love it. I think we can all embrace the fact that we are all on a journey, on a continuum. Nature and norms are all subject, that we are hubristic if we pretend that we understand. And my last thought that I will leave you with is check out something that you probably haven't heard of. It's called apophatic anthropology. It's usually associated with apophatic theology, and that is saying that we can't know who God is, we can't know what man is, we can't know what nature is, that to avoid the sin of condescension that Renee talked about and hubris is to have this sense of not knowing and to say we can't know, but we can ask. So thank you, Spencer, for participating in the audience participation portion of our show, and thank you for listening.
It's this one here, right? Should be, yes. That's the one. Let me go full screen. Great. There you go.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm super excited to be here with you. Thank you for having me. My name is Jose Nateras, and this is my presentation entitled Navigating the Maze, Monstrous Sense, or Ariadne's Thread. In Greek mythology, the only way that the hero Theseus could navigate King Minos' labyrinth was using a ball of thread, gifted by his lover, Princess Ariadne. However, another figure navigates the labyrinth without this particular gift, the Minotaur. In his 1947 short story, The House of Asterion, Jorge Luis Borges humanizes this classic monstrous figure, allowing the Minotaur to describe the labyrinth in his own words, not as a prison maze, but as a house that is, to quote, the same size as the world, or rather, it is the world. Seeing the labyrinth through his eyes is seeing the world as it is, a maze requiring navigation. In Charlie Koval's short-lived Netflix series, Chaos, from 2024, a modernized exploration of Greek mythology, the Minotaur was depicted not as a half-man, half-bull hybrid, but as a fully formed human male, Glaucus, the non-verbal son of President Minos and the twin brother of Ariadne. In Anna Ziegler's 2018 stage play, The Minotaur, similarly, she focuses on the sibling relationship between Ariadne and the titular monster. However, in Ziegler's version, the Minotaur is able to articulate himself, in line with Borges's Asterion. These adaptations all interestingly juxtapose Ariadne and the Minotaur's respective means of navigating the labyrinth. In her book, The Witch's Flight, The Cinematic, The Black Femme, and the Image of Common Sense, Kara Keeling argues there is not just one common sense, but various common senses, as many as there are groups of living beings with brains, end quote. These different characterizations of the Minotaur present a viable alternative, as Keeling might put it, to the heteronormative modes of navigating the prison maze of Western society. This particular genre of common sense is one shared by those whom the hegemonic forces of a Eurocentric heteronormative culture have traditionally characterized as monstrous, that of queer, Black, Indigenous, people of color, living beings. The Minotaur is a particular example of monstrosity. In Monster Culture, 7 Theses, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen notes that, quote, monsters must be examined within the intricate matrix of relations, social, cultural, and literary historical, that generate them, end quote. A primary generating matrix of relation for the Minotaur is the familial. In his article, Crete in History and Myth, scholar Theodore Ziolkowski summarizes the mythic tradition of Minos, king of Crete. Son of the Phoenician princess Europa and Zeus, king of the gods, Minos offended the sea god Poseidon. As a result, his wife, Queen Pasiphae, was cursed to fall in love with a bull, and the monstrous child of that taboo interspecies love was the Minotaur. Minos' resident inventor cum captive, Daedalus, was charged with building a labyrinth beneath the palace within which to imprison the monster born with the head of a bull and the body of a man. Regarding what Cohen might describe as the cultural and literary historical matrix of the Minotaur's genesis, Ziolkowski presents the claim that European civilization began on this small, elongated island of Crete, the southernmost of the Greek Isles, which lies symbolically midway between Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is from this symbolic midway point between Europe, named after Minos' mother, and the rest of the world that the hybrid form of the Minotaur emerges. In Cohen's first thesis, The Monster's Body is a Cultural Body, he writes, quote, the monster is born only at this metaphoric crossroads as an embodiment of a certain cultural moment, of a time, a feeling, and a place, end quote. Ziolkowski labels Crete the birthplace of European civilization, situated at global and cultural crossroads, and that birthplace is one that the Minotaur shares. In fact, the Minotaur exists as a manifestation of this crossroads. As half bull and half man, he embodies the intersection, crossing of animal and human. In his third and fourth theses, the monster is the harbinger of category crisis and the monster dwells at the gates of difference, Cohen describes the ways in which monsters defy categorization, existing in a liminal mixed space, ultimately being set apart as different or the other. This othering facilitates the, quote, subjugation of one cultural body by another by writing the body excluded from personhood and agency as in every way different, monstrous, end quote. This exclusion from personhood is something that scholar Zakiya Iman Jackson unpacks in Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World. Jackson's work considers the ways in which Western science and philosophy have dehumanized Black people, enshrining racial hierarchies that bestialize Blackness. Jackson looks to the work of African diasporic writers and artists to discern the ways in which their work both critiques animalization and serves to overturn the ontological and epistemic regimes that place the human, understood to be white from a Western perspective, above other species in a way that defines Blackness in terms of animality. For Jackson, this overturning acts to, quote, present possibilities that point our attention to potential modes for worlding that are more advantageous to life writ large, end quote. As opposed to accepting a westernized world view that presents personhood in its own European image atop a racialized hierarchy that subjugates other cultural bodies as monstrous, bestial, and animal, Jackson raises the question, quote, if being recognized as human offers no reprieve from ontologizing dominance and violence, then what might we gain from the rupture of the human, end quote. The Minotaur, with his bull head bursting forth from his man's shoulders, is a stark visualization of this very rupture. Able to navigate the labyrinth, the walls of which make up the entirety of the world as he knows it, without a tool like Ariadne's thread, the Minotaur demonstrates what might be gained from looking beyond the scope of what is recognized as human. To recognize alternative ways of moving through the world, accessible only through perspectives common to those excluded from normative understandings of personhood and agency. This is to recognize value in the monstrous. Literary critic and scholar J. Hillis Miller considers Ariadne's way of navigating the labyrinth as a mode of textual analysis. In his article, Ariadne's Thread, Repetition, and the Narrative Line, Miller writes, quote, thread and labyrinth. Thread intricately crinkled to and fro as the retracing of the labyrinth, which defeats the labyrinth but makes another intricate web at the same time. Pattern is here superimposed on pattern, end quote. Ariadne's navigation of the labyrinth retraces its patterns, reifying the path set out for her by her father, the ruler of the land, a literal example of the patriarchy. Daedalus created the labyrinth per King Minos' order, a means of imprisoning the result of Queen Pasiphae's infidelity, her failure performing the role of wife. Ariadne's gift of a ball of thread to Theseus serves as an act of betrothal. By providing Theseus with her method of navigating the labyrinth, she is presenting herself to Theseus as a prospective wife. Miller notes and explores the echoing themes, motifs, patterns, and repetition that arise in Ariadne's matrilineal legacy. This is something that Ziegler examines in her play, particularly through an exchange between the Minotaur and Ariadne. Ariadne, Theseus, he's just young, that's all. He'll grow up. Anyway, boys are children much, much longer, maybe forever. That's what our mother says. The Minotaur, our mother? What would she know about boys? She knows more about bulls. Ew, don't say that. And your grandmother, Europa, was seduced by Zeus in the form of a bull. But that was Zeus. Zeus. Whatever form he takes, you indulge him. So you think you're better than our mother? I don't think I would fall in love with a bull if that's what you're asking. You're no different. Yes, I am. You're fooling yourself. The Minotaur is correct. Ariadne would become a wife, just like her mother. In fact, she eventually married Dionysus, who has a tradition of being depicted with horns. Horns notwithstanding, Ariadne's course of navigating the labyrinth is a heteronormative connection, a line, a betrothal bound with thread, which is a tool for weaving, a symbol of domesticity. According to some iterations of Ariadne's mythology, when this betrothal is broken by Theseus, who abandons her on Naxos, she hangs herself, only for Dionysus to take pity on her. This parallels the myth of Arachne, a conflation that Miller describes as a, quote, superimposition of the myths of Ariadne and Arachne, two similar but not wholly congruent stories, both involving the images of thread or weaving, end quote. Ziegler similarly points to this parallel, having her version of a Greek chorus, comprised of a priest, a lawyer, and a rabbi, respond to Ariadne's claim of having entered a weaving contest by telling her, "You're confusing your stories. That's Arachne. You're Ariadne. You never did that." It's a common mistake. We all at some point or other wish our story was someone else's. This wishing for a different story highlights the ways Ariadne is just as confined as her brother, the difference being the sense with which they navigate their respective prisons. Ari, as Ariadne prefers to be called in Koval's Chaos, is similarly forced to navigate her own labyrinth. As Ari attempts to find her way through the narrow, twisting corridors of familial fealty, national allegiance, cosmic prophecy, and the unjust treatment of Trojan refugees, her moral compass fails to orient her. She gets lost within the maze of lies and manipulations her father constructs as the head of state. Beneath President Minos' compound, there is an actual labyrinth. This prison contains the Minotaur, who is used as a tool for state violence, a monster wielded to instill fear in political dissidents. Of these adaptations, the rendition of the Minotaur in Chaos is the most bestial. For President Minos, it was prophesied that your end begins in the marital bed. The first child to draw breath will kill you dead. Ari's twin brother, Glaucus, was born first, and unbeknownst to everyone in the kingdom, aside from Daedalus, President Minos had him imprisoned in the labyrinth, his head encased in a horned helmet. As opposed to other iterations of the Minotaur, Glaucus is not free to move through the maze, and is instead trapped within a cell, only released to be used as a method of execution for political prisoners. This release is triggered by a particular sound, as explained by Daedalus, noting that when the inventor visits Glaucus, he hears/recognizes the difference in Daedalus' approach. During these visits, Glaucus is nonviolent. Glaucus, played by Egyptian-British actor Fadi al-Sayed, is only revealed without his horned helmet when Ari visits him. This coincides with President Minos using the release trigger. When Minos comes to kill Glaucus in an attempt to satisfy the gods, the sound of the trigger causes the Minotaur to violently slay Daedalus before Minos in turn kills him, only for Ari to avenge her brother by killing Minos. Regardless of birth order, she drew breath before Glaucus. In this adaptation, stripped of the ability to move freely through the world of his prison maze, Glaucus/the Minotaur still utilizes his senses in a fashion different from his sister. He relies on his hearing. It is sound that orients him in relation to his surroundings, and his sense of hearing that identifies the objects which enter his domain. Asterion, the Minotaur of Borges' adaptation, also relies on his sense of hearing. The prose voice of Asterion's narration says, quote, "I hear their steps or their voices in the depths of the stone galleries, and I run joyfully to find them," end quote, illustrating how he orients himself within the labyrinth through both sound and his relationship to the space. For him, the labyrinth is not merely a tangle of corridors designed to entrap and disorient. It is his home. He doesn't apprehend the maze as a prison to be escaped, but as a house he inhabits. Quote, "It is true that I never leave my house, but it is also true that its doors, whose numbers are infinite, are open day and night to men and to animals as well," end quote. To call upon Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, quote, "Orientations shape not only how we inhabit space, but how we apprehend this world of shared inhabitants, as well as who or what we direct our energy and attention toward." Ahmed describes queer phenomenology as a way of reorienting the relation or positionality to the different, the other, that which the normative fears. By understanding that to feel fear is to feel afraid of something, Ahmed points to the emotion's directionality, saying, quote, "We might fear an object that approaches us. The feeling of fear is directed toward that object, while it also apprehends the object in a certain way as being fearsome," end quote. For Asterion, he does not apprehend the objects, men or animals, entering his house as fearsome. He runs towards those objects. The sound of their approach is something that draws him closer. Athenian tributes sent into the maze navigated differently. In the subject position, an Athenian tribute recognizing the approaching object of the Minotaur as a threat and orients themselves away from it accordingly. Ahmed writes, quote, "The attribution of feeling toward an object, I feel afraid because you are fearsome, moves the subject away from the object, creating distance through the registering of proximity as a threat," end quote. One could say that Asterion, registering proximity to the Athenian tributes, maintains a normative common sense. He doesn't recognize them as a threat, so he doesn't move away from them. However, Borges makes it clear that the Minotaur knows one of these Athenians will kill him. Quote, "I know that one of them prophesied at the moment of his death that someday my Redeemer would come. I know my Redeemer lives, and he will finally rise above the dust. If my ear could capture all the sounds of the world, I should hear his steps." End quote. For Asterion, understanding the object's threat does not change his orientation to it. Does not change his orientation to it. As a monstrous subject, he has a monstrous sense of the world and navigates the world in line with this monstrousness. To examine the monstrous figure of the Minotaur, as Cohen calls us to, within the labyrinthine matrix of relations from which he is generated, calls us to examine the monstrous sense with which he navigates those labyrinths. The Minotaur orients himself through a common sense that belongs to the monstrous, which, to return to Keeling and Jackson, performs as a viable alternative, quote, "mode of worlding that is more advantageous to life writ large," end quote. Instead of adhering to understandings of humanity that constrain us to moving in a straight/heteronormative line, retreading traditional paths of relationality within a prison maze built upon the hegemonic structures of Western society, we can recognize what the rupture of the human might offer. To recognize that rupture as what normatively might be called monstrous is to see the potential, quote, "reprieve from ontologizing dominance and violence," end quote, that monstrous sense provides. And here are my sources.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much, panel. This was really, really terrific. I had a wonderful time watching all of you get monstrous. That was really great. So let's open it up to questions from the assembled scholars. Who's got a question? Including the panel can ask questions as well. Yeah, Blake.
All right. So my question, first off, I realize adaptation is something that I think we've come to realize we kind of need both the original and the remake or the adaptation to exist to really have these kind of conversations. But I was curious, Amy? Right? Okay. My question about Carmilla has to do with, I guess, the ambivalence that exists within that text, because I think it's easy for even readers who sympathize with that sapphic relationship to realize that Carmilla in that text is, no matter how you see it, a predator. But we also have these really, really beautifully written lines that Carmilla delivers to Lucy that seem almost more intimate than heteronormative relationships were in the period. So there is this kind of like fantasy that exists within Carmilla, even if at the end of the day, Lefanu has her killed off. So I suppose my interest is in that sentiment itself, right? I'm curious about how maybe that intimacy is dealt with in the adaptations that you were talking about, and if giving that sort of legitimate affect is what you perceive as merely a ruse, or if there's something that we as the reader maybe latch on to because of how heartfelt it can feel.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, great question. So, well, the first thing your question made me think of is Carmen Maria Machado, who created that annotated edition, is famous partly for writing this memoir in the dream house of an abusive queer relationship, right? And so she has said that part of what she was trying to do is like not to like sanitize Carmilla, but to create space in which even, in her words, fucked up queer relationships could be, or queer stories could be told, right? So I think one dimension that at least her adaptation opens up is this question of like, do representations have to be positive in order to be valuable, right? But I think I agree with you that I think it's precisely the ambiguity of the text that's really interesting to a lot of people, and to me too. And I think of it, I've been thinking a lot about the distinction between representation and desire, and I was really excited to hear that in Maddie's talk today, because desire always does exist in this like ambiguous space, right? And it can only exist when it's not, maybe I shouldn't say it can only exist, but it thrives in spaces that aren't confined and that are a little bit like wilder, right? And so I think that's part of the reason that the text keeps having life, even though it comes from such a different and more repressive time. There's more to say, but I want to, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Yeah.
My question is for Jose. I was really struck by how the narratives that you're talking about play into this recent trend we're seeing in media of letting monsters tell their own stories. And I think that there's a lot of narrative work that those kind of reinterpretations can do, but I haven't engaged with most of the reinterpretations you were discussing. So I'm wondering, especially in Chaos and in Ziegler's play, when we're inhabiting this space that is either like empathetic and really inside the head of, or sympathetic towards and having a sort of softer portrayal of the Minotaur, do you feel like these narratives are trying just to open up broadly empathetic space and to try and present more like in-depth, nuanced, compelling representations of every character in the narrative? Or do you feel like these people creating these stories are moving to a space where they sort of move the lens of monsterity? I'm seeing, like, from your discussions of Minos especially, it seems like there's a reorientation of where villainy sits in these stories. So I'm just like wondering about how that narrative tension plays out.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think part of it has to do with a sort of understanding and reckoning of relationality with regards to power, and like power as a political force, power as a structuring to the world that we live in. And more and more people are starting to understand that there's culpability at play with regards to the way power is wielded. And very often, the more that we consider the organizing forces of our world by way of like power exercising, we can see that monsters are kind of created. Like the constructed nature of a monster is something that is related to the way that power wants them to be seen, wants the wider world to interact with them, wants others to see and fear them. Chaos is a really interesting example because as a series, like this is one of 3 prophetic through lines that the miniseries is dealing with. But ultimately, thematically, it's concerned with the fall of the Olympian gods and the sort of refusal to release, from Zeus's part in particular, played by Jeff Goldblum, his like refusal to accept his waning power, and how that refusal makes his behavior even more erratic and monstrous. And Minos is very much depicted not really as the big bad of his through line, really, but as a sort of pawn of the gods. And so how in trying to serve and uphold those structures of power, you behave in monstrous ways. Even as Glaucus, the Minotaur in Chaos, is kind of the most bestial and pitiable, he has the least voice. He never speaks at all throughout the whole series. You know, he is treated very much as the monster in ways that these other versions don't really. So to your point of like this inspiration to give voice to the monstrous, I think it's starting to recognize it has to do with a trend of understanding that any of us could be made the monster by the powers that be depending on our scenario. So maybe it's worth listening to what they have to say. Borges is an Argentinian writer, and The House of Asterion was written, I want to say, like the 40s or 50s. So like this is a trend that kind of has deep roots. And the fact that it's coming from the positionality of South America, I think, is also interesting and worth noting.
Amen to that. That's something I'm particularly interested in, is the retelling of the story from the monstrous point of view. What else? Who else? Yes, Michael.
So I've got a question about the cultural colonization in Dracula 2020. In the original Dracula, in that reverse colonization, it's portrayed as unequivocally bad. It is an infection that, you know, causes impurity in Victorian mores. In the cultural colonization of the 2020 version, where the foreigner becomes westernized, is that seen as something, again, sort of inherently negative? It almost strikes me that it's an example of a fear of an alien assimilating too well to Western culture, and maybe even displacing Western culture in that way. How do we see that cultural colonization? Is that just a power Dracula has, or is that representative of something larger and something that we should be fearful of in the same way Victorian readers were supposed to be fearful of that reverse colonization in Stoker's novel?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, you know, your question kind of reminds me of there is a character in Dracula 2020. She is a nun called Sister Agatha. In the novel, she's a minor character, but in this new adaptation, she's a major character. And she says, one time when she was talking to Jonathan Harker, she said, "You're a British man." Something like, "You're a Bridgman, a combination of presumptions beyond compare." And so I kind of feel like that quote is probably kind of a central attitude towards Britishness in this whole adaptation. It's kind of a self-conscious self-criticism there. So yeah, this series was written by Mark Gatiss, a British writer. So I feel like he is consciously kind of trying to give Dracula a voice to speak for his own. So when we think of Gatiss' probable attitude in this light, it seems like this cultural colonization is his, his way to criticize how the dominant British culture might be not self-aware enough, might be assumptions beyond compare, because we see that dominant Western culture is probably is a phenomenon now around the globe. So yeah, I think from the point of view of the writers of this film, cultural colonization might be seen as a self-conscious criticism on the culture that he is in. Yeah.
Thanks, Joseph. Okay, any final thoughts? Thank you all so much for coming, and let's have a big round of applause for the panel. Thank you so much.